Well, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on science policy careers. We have an excellent panel of speakers who are going to be talking about their diverse careers in science policy. The American Institute of Biological Sciences is very pleased to be holding this event as part of our Leadership in Biology webinar series. This has been a monthly webinar series that Aibs started about a year ago. We've had diverse topics covered, everything most recently from using gene drive to control the spread of the Zika virus to events like today about careers in science policy. So I would encourage everyone after this event to take a look at the Leadership in Biology webinar series and to see if there's other recordings from the past that might be of interest to all of you. I just want to say a few housekeeping things before we get started. First of all, I just want to let people know that we are recording today's webinar, and this video will be made available to everyone who's on the webinar, as well as those who registered for the event in advance. If you have any technical issues at any point, please use the chat box, and one of my colleagues will be in touch with you to hopefully resolve those issues. If you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. Although I will not be looking at the questions until later in today's talk, you can feel free to enter a question at any time. Those will be queued up in order for when we do get to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. We are joined today by Dr. Lita Bennison with the National Science Foundation, Dr. Karen Maurer with the National Institutes of Health, and Dr. Robert Gropp of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. I'll give a bit more of a detailed introduction of each of them before they speak. And just so you know, once each of our panelists have had a chance to talk about their career experiences in science policy, we will have plenty of time for Q&A before ending this event punctually at 3 o'clock. So first up, Dr. Lita Bennison is a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation in the Directorate for Computer and Information Science and Engineering. She has served as editor-in-chief for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and was a recipient of the Aibs Emerging Public Policy Leadership Award. Lita has bachelor's degrees in neurophysiology and education from Princeton University and a PhD in integrative physiology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She also holds a graduate certificate in science and technology policy. I'll turn it over to you, Lita.
Hi, well, it's a pleasure to meet all of you in the worldwide webosphere, and I'm absolutely happy to take any questions about the path to a career in science policy. And to be very frank up front, I still feel like I'm on like the beginning uptick of that career in science policy, but I can tell you very briefly about what led me to where I am. I was doing the PhD track, and much of our funding came from the NIH. And what happened was during the, as the economy kind of went down back in 2008 to 2010, my advisor started really struggling with finding funding. And I started seeing what her life was like, kind of with the grant grind. And I was like, you know, I love science, but I just don't see myself embracing that sort of lifestyle or career choice. And so I was really racking my brains about, well, I'm in this PhD program. What can I use it for if I don't think I'm going to go down the path of academia? And I actually just happened to see a bulletin on campus for this program in science policy and governance. And I thought to myself, that's an area I've never even considered. I have zero political science background, but I'll take a look. And there was an introductory course on campus taught by somebody who had a proficient amount of experience in science policy. And he even wrote a book on science policy. And so when I took the introductory class, it just clicked for me. These were all things, issues and problems that I had been thinking about for a while, especially in light of the funding challenges that my lab was going through. And as I was learning more about the budgetary process and how policy is made, how science can be used to shape policy and how policy shapes science, I just found it fascinating. It instantly clicked for me, and I decided to stay in the science policy program, and I got a graduate certificate in it. But while I was in the program, I really wanted to make sure that I could start getting some practical experiences in science policy, because it's one thing to enjoy the coursework, but it's something totally different to see whether or not you actually like the experience of working in the field. So I did an internship at the National Science Foundation one summer, which happened to coincide with a summer that my lab had no funding for research, so it worked out very well. And that was my first taste of what work in the science policy area was like, and I absolutely loved it. I ended up working on science policy education initiatives, and I went back to graduate school to continue research, and I joined the Journal of Science Policy and Governance as an editor to once again continue keeping up my practical work in science policy. And then I ended up moving up to editor-in-chief of the journal, and I got to experience and learn about really cutting-edge issues in the field, and once again, really enjoying it. And then I applied for the AIBS Emerging Public Policy Leadership Award, and with that award, I was actually able to then go to Washington, D.C. and meet with congressional staffers and really have these conversations with them, which I had been prepped with regards to my coursework and some of the NSF experience and journal experience that I had. And I loved it. I loved talking about science and science policy. And I knew from that point on that I really wanted to apply for the AAAS fellowship. And so I did. And now I'm working in computer science education initiatives. I really love it. I like it here in Washington, D.C. It was hard after leaving Colorado, but I've acclimated. And I definitely plan on staying in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Lita. So next, we have Dr. Karen Maurer, who is a health science policy analyst at the National Institute of Mental Health Office of Autism Research Coordination within the National Institutes of Health. Before joining NIH, Karen worked on biomedical research policy at a government relations consulting firm, as a legislative affairs officer at the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, and as a Christine Mearsine Science and Technology Policy Graduate Fellow at the National Academy of Sciences. Karen received her PhD in biological chemistry and molecular pharmacology from Harvard Medical School, and she graduated from Colorado State University with a BS in biochemistry. Karen.
Okay, great. Excuse me. I'm going to start out by warning everyone that I'm getting over a cold, so I may have a few voice problems, but I apologize and bear with me. But I'm really happy to be here today. This is actually one of my favorite things to do, is to talk about science policy careers and how to transition potentially from bench science to a science policy career. So I thought I'd start out just by talking a little bit about why I became interested in science policy. Kind of similar to our last speaker, as I was even in grad school, I was never really interested in following sort of the traditional academic research track. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I'd do research in industry or some other venue. One of the things I found as I did more and more through research is that research, rightfully so, is very narrowly focused. And I, on the other hand, sort of was always interested in a lot of different things. I was always interested in a lot of subjects in school, including government, history, English, and writing. And so sort of the more I went down the research track, the more I felt like I was losing some of those interests, some of those skills, and not really able to enjoy sort of the well-rounded subject areas that I had enjoyed throughout my education. And so sort of toward the end of grad school, as I started to think about what other career possibilities might be through career activities, sort of like this webinar, I started to hear more and learn more about the field of science policy. And to me, it sounded like a great way to potentially combine many of my interests. But toward the end of grad school, I also was the first to acknowledge I hadn't really done anything to prepare myself for this kind of job besides, research at the bench. And so that was kind of a wake-up call late in my graduate school course that, I should probably try and get some other experience if this was something I thought I was really interested in pursuing. So after grad school, I decided to go ahead and do a postdoc. And I was really attracted to the intramural program at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, which is near the DC area. And in addition to being a great lab, I was interested in living in the DC area as a potential way to meet more people who were engaged in science policy, learn more about the types of job options, and really start to do some networking and activities in that regard. So when I was a postdoc, I spent some of my weekend time volunteering at a science museum of the National Academies. I looked for other ways to get involved in the NIH community. And luckily, these activities led me to get the Christine Mirzayan Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which is a three-month fellowship run by the National Academies. And that was a really great experience, really confirmed that science policy was the direction that I wanted to go, and was really lucky in that I was able to transition directly from that fellowship to my first policy job, which was at FASTEP. And I can talk a little bit more about the types of things I did in my positions in a little bit. But first, I just wanted to kind of broaden and talk about some of the things you might think of if you think a science policy career might be right for you. So one thing is, I always like to sort of joke, if you like to learn a little about a lot instead of a lot about a little. So the definition of, sort of being a research scientist is really honing in on one very specific question, and you're the world expert on that question. Whereas when you're in policy, oftentimes you have a much more broad landscape of what's going on in the sciences, and you don't always have the time or the need to sort of drill down into great detail on every single subject you need to cover. If you like keeping up on current events, politics, issues in the research and science field, whether it's workforce issues or debating around climate change or evolution, those types of issues, those are a lot of the things that come up. A lot of science policy dealing with people. You work often with a lot of committees. So if you like consensus building or resolving disagreements from different perspectives, and being sort of a moderator and mediator, science policy can involve a lot of that. And then if you enjoy teaching or explaining scientific concepts to non-scientists, that's also a very common theme among science policy careers. If you sort of like the challenge of trying to describe like your PhD thesis to your grandmother and see if she can understand it, then that's a very a typical thing in science policy to do. So it might be a career for you in that case. Another thing you'll discover is as you learn more about science policy, you'll sort of realize that there are a lot of jobs that fall sort of under the general umbrella of what people will sometimes call science policy. I currently have a job in government. There's, science policy jobs people work for congressional staff. There's an office at the White House. All of the federal science agencies like NIH, NSF have scientists working in science policy. There are associations and scientific societies, so like Aibs or any of your specific trade organizations. People in industry have, science policy backgrounds for some positions. Universities and academic institutions will have research development offices that might have people that are sort of into science policy or government relations professionals, research foundations. So you can see there's a wide array of venues that you can pursue science policy. And another thing to kind of keep in mind is that jobs can vary a lot in how close to the science you are day to day. And I'll give some examples of that when I talk a little bit about my previous positions. But when you're considering a career in science policy, you might think about sort of how close to the primary research science you want to stay. So then just to give a little bit more information about the kinds of things I've done in my positions are, so at the National Academies, when I was a fellow there, I worked at, I did my rotation during my fellowship at the Marion Koshland Science Museum. So that was a lot of public outreach. I helped to develop public programming for the museum. So it was really translating lay or scientific information to very lay-friendly information and thinking of programs that could be fun for children and families. And that was a lot of fun and a great way to really hone in on translating scientific information. When I was at FASIB, I was doing mostly advocacy, so working very closely in terms of lobbying Congress for science funding for science agencies like NIH and NSF. That organization is basically an umbrella organization of several scientific societies, so there was a lot of consensus building in that position, and you really had to stay at sort of top level issues in order to get agreement among all of the members. My last job it was a private government relations and consulting firm called Lewisburg Associates. We worked with clients who were mostly research universities or scientific societies, and that combined sort of similar advocacy to what I'd done at FASIB with sort of more detailed consulting work. So we helped not only advocate for more science funding, but also we helped advise clients on the trends that were going on in federal science agencies, how to navigate federal science agencies to get more federal grants and funding. And then now at my current job at NIMH, I'm part of an office that helps manage a federal advisory committee that advises the Secretary of Health and Human Services on autism activities across the government. So we do a lot to translate scientific advances in autism for the autism community. We do have a lot of analysis of the portfolio of research projects on autism at NIH and other agencies. So you can kind of see, like I've noticed already, my current job is a lot closer to sort of the primary science than my previous jobs have been. I actually will read primary literature and papers in this job, whereas that usually was not necessary in my previous jobs. So then just to sort of wrap up, some of the skills you might have sort of caught you would need to pursue a career in science policy. Some of the general themes are communication. Really in all of my jobs there's been an aspect of needing to convey scientific information and the importance of science to non-scientists. Writing, especially non-technical writing, it's great to be able to write a really clear scientific paper, but also to be able to write in more of a newspaper or news article style is often important. And being comfortable with different versions of public speaking, that often comes up in these types of jobs. As I mentioned, consensus building, leading committees to a consensus position, synthesizing different ideas into sort of summaries or compromises. And then there's a lot of working with people, so networking, being able to maintain a network of people in your community, being well connected, fostering professional relationships. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, I think the good news is, especially if you're still a trainee, is that the skills you get as a PhD are actually very applicable to science policy. You have a lot of the skills you already sort of need as your basis. A lot of them are transferable, so you're an expert in a scientific area, so you know how things should be conveyed accurately. You understand sort of the scientific process and critical thinking, and those are skills I think appreciated in every office. And I've been really surprised by sort of how many times the scientific process has kind of been helpful in figuring out, how to analyze a policy question or how to analyze some data that helps strengthen an advocacy argument. So sort of having that thought process really helps in a lot of different ways. You can probably learn quickly and master new topics as a scientist. If you're doing any sort of research project, you have experience in project management and organization. And as a scientist, you're doing presentations as well, so you have some presentation skills. I feel really lucky in that all of the employers I've had, sort of from the beginning, had a really unique appreciation for the strengths that PhDs could bring to their office and the kinds of positions that they were filling. I think maybe that's not across the board always the case. I think one of the things that is a challenge and can be frustrating if you're interested in science policy and looking to transition from the bench, is that despite having all these skills, you really still need some kind of practical skills or evidence on your CV, sort of besides the research, that you can apply these skills. And while that can be, a little bit discouraging, especially if you've gone through a lot of scientific training already, there are things you can do, which I think we can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. But I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering your questions in the latter part of the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Before I introduce our last speaker, actually, let me remedy a mistake that I made. I failed to introduce myself at the beginning of this webinar. I'm Julie Polakovich-Carr. I'm the Public Policy Manager for the American Institute of Biological Sciences. So with that, I will introduce Dr. Robert Gropp, who is the Interim Co-Executive Director of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. He also serves as the Director of Community Programs for AIBS, which includes the Public Policy Office. He started his career in policy as a presidential management intern, now called the Presidential Management Fellowship, at the Social Security Administration. Rob has spent time working in both Senate and House offices. He has worked at AIBS since 2003, where he began as a senior policy associate. Rob earned his BA in biology from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his PhD in plant ecology from the University of Oklahoma. Rob.
Thank you, Julie. So at first I thought, well, this will be fun to go third because I can just fill in the blanks. But now I'm really struggling because I think Lita and Karen both did an outstanding job and covered a good number of the things that I very much was going to say. So I'll try to maybe augment a few of their points and sort of start with a trajectory to fill in some of the blanks that from what Julie just introduced. So as Julie mentioned, I was, and kind of like Lita, I was preparing for a academic track, kind of research track. I also, very much like Karen, had a long-standing interest in policy and politics, and I very much wanted the science. I felt the application of science to, in my case, environmental issues and natural resource management, things like that, was very important. And I had an interest in climate change and how do we get this the science transition. And so as I was finishing up graduate school, I briefly considered, do I go to law school? Is that the best way to apply it? Do I look for or do I move more toward a policy kind of track? And really through happenstance, as I was finishing grad school, the Presidential Management Intern Program presented itself, and it was a compelling way to sort of explore federal service. At that time, I almost kind of viewed it as a postdoc for policy. And I was fortunate that while in grad school, I found ways to engage myself in broader activities beyond just bench research. So I was active in a lot of university committees, student government, things like that gave me an ability to understand how in an organization you approach challenges, problems, questions, how you struggle with things. Back at that point in time, I was in Oklahoma and the internet was kind of catching on. And of course, the big concern was, how do we have to block certain parts of the internet? Oh my gosh, we can't have this. And what if people go to the library and access naughty pictures? So that all led to university committees to struggle with, all right, well, how do you manage that? What kind of policy do you do that allows you to maintain academic freedom and scholarship, but also, kind of recognize that you're a publicly funded institution? So as part of groups of faculty and administrators and everything came together to explore that. And it was an interesting experiment or growth experience for me because you really started to have to look at different questions and understand different perspectives and look for, as Karen was talking about, compromise that meets your goals and understand that everybody has very different perspectives and how do you move along the line. So that kind of experience, along with some other things in grad school, really ultimately played a pretty significant role in my getting my first jobs. And so as I entered the presidential management program, at that time, there weren't a lot of science agencies hiring people through that program for science positions. There were a lot more opportunities in sort of health service, human service, education, things like that. And that's sort of the track that I took for a couple of years. And really, when I was being interviewed and hired, they loved the fact that I had a science background that gave me analytical skills. It gave me those kinds of things that I think Karen was just kind of describing. They were very transferable. They also loved that I had had some kind of practical experience developing, that I could demonstrate that I had participated in things that dealt with policy questions. And the actual question wasn't as important as the fact that I had been involved in actual policy deliberations and consensus building and committees that involve very disparate perspectives or different constituencies. And so I had those kind of skills to demonstrate, and I had the soft skills that are hard to assess a lot of times when you're trying to hire someone. But it gave you the ability to show that you could work with very different communities, and that's something that's very, very important in policy, is respecting differences of opinions, looking for common ground, understanding where people might actually be talking about the same thing but talking about it with different vocabulary. So how do you identify that and bring people together? So that positioned me for my first job, and I wound up, as Julie mentioned from the bio, actually going to work where the logical transition from a plant ecology degree is the Social Security Administration. It's a very 1-2 kind of step, but the counsel I had while I was in grad school from someone who had a long, distinguished career in government was always be prepared, but be open to opportunity, and look for things where you might be able to make a contribution, where you could feel good about what you're doing, where you can grow as an individual, and where you genuinely feel you can make a valuable contribution to something that you care about. And so I took that opportunity, and I took it really I wasn't sure if I would end up back in science. It was sort of, well, this is a real left turn from what I'd trained to do. But as everybody was just talking about, the skills that I had developed, the analytical skills, I found myself using those all the time. And so it was really just sort of applying the scientific mindset and way of thinking about things to very different problems and questions. And it was exciting because I was learning all kinds of new things. So I wound up learning more about economics and sociology and things like that than I ever would have, otherwise. So it was very rewarding. And then from that, another opportunity presented itself to go work on Capitol Hill. And I was able to take a jump and jump into that environment, which was fascinating from a number of levels. One, it's a very different environment. It's obviously very political, where I had been in an independent federal agency that was much less political. It was much more of an administrative kind of an agency that wanted data and was very deliberate about making decisions and had very long processes to make a decision, to working in an environment where sometimes data really doesn't matter. And so it forced you to really develop your other skills, your ability to function in a much faster time frame. You really don't have necessarily the leisure to take a week to work on something. You might need to write something in an hour or half an hour, and it better be right, it better be quick, and it better be persuasive. So it rounded out my sort of communication skills and my ability to work with people where you have very fundamental differences. And so I think all of those were early experiences that really helped me develop myself to be what I think is someone who understands how I can make a valuable contribution in the policy environment. And so from that, I came back into science policy at Aibs, and it's been really useful because now I can think back, and oftentimes we're talking to a federal agency, and I now have this sort of background that I still carry forward with me that says, for the Department of Labor, I work for Social Security, and I know people that work, and I talk to NSF or NIH all the time. One of the things I've always learned is each of those agencies and the people in those agencies, they operate on their very different cultures. And that can be very useful information when you're trying to talk to people to understand what their pressures are, what they're having to manage internally, or how to operate, or whether their hands are tied and they're implementing something by regulation or statute and they don't have the flexibility. So I guess the take-home message there is it often comes back to really kind of stepping back and trying to understand the people that you're trying to work with and appreciate their perspective and their needs. The things that I think routinely kind of come back in the policy environment, and particularly if you want to make the transition, are look for opportunities that allow you to demonstrate your interest and commitment in working in policy in some way or another. It's also important to recognize that there's a really wide spectrum of policy jobs, and it can be everything from the very academic sort of policy research, doing a lot of literature reviews and writing white papers and very quantitative analysis kinds of things, all the way over, I would say, to the other extreme, which is very political and immediate and advocacy heavy. And so there's a big continuum. And in addition to that continuum, there's then obviously the different stakeholders. So are you from an agency? If you're working in an agency, your role is going to be defined, by implementing agency objectives or helping to shape those. If you're working for Congress or a member of Congress, your obligation is to represent their interests and to help make sure that their agenda is being implemented, and to work with the public to understand what national needs are or what the district needs are, and to help articulate those. If you're working in a scientific society, such as Aibs or FASA, it's representing your constituencies, your membership, and it's a little bit of mix. It's a little bit of advocacy. It's a little bit of policy research. The one thing that carries through with all these are communication and the ability I really think it comes back to communicate and quickly, and with not necessarily having all of the facts or all the data that you would like. Sometimes you have to just go with the best that you have. It's also important that I think really to gain experience in developing written communication skills that aren't just the formal technical paper, but it really does come down to being able to identify the audience that you're trying to communicate with, and recognizing how to communicate with them, whether it's a short essay, whether it's a paper, whether it's a discussion, all those sorts of things. And I think that's the one place where there's still a need, and I encourage particularly graduate students to get as much experience as they can in terms of developing your portfolio of writing samples. And so finding ways to write different things and get them put out there. So I think I will probably stop talking now, because I kind of feel like I will just keep reiterating the very valid points and suggestions that Lita and Karen made. But I look forward to any kind of questions from anybody.
Thank you, Rob. So I have a couple of questions for our panelists before I go to the ones that our attendees have started to enter in. So again, if you have a question for any of our panelists or all of them, please go ahead and enter that in the Q&A box, and that will be queued up here for this portion of the webinar. So we'll start with Lita. You have a certificate in science and technology policy. Do you think a policy degree is necessary for this line of work?
A policy degree is certainly not necessary, which is good because most institutions don't offer a science and technology policy degree. What it did do was it gave me the ability to say I have a demonstrated interest in science policy. So the fellowships that are available are very competitive, and they become increasingly competitive over the years for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that many of the fellowship offices look for, fellowship programs look for, is that demonstrated interest in science policy. So that was what the certificate enabled me to have, was that demonstrated interest. But I was able to also, I believe, demonstrate interest in a variety of other ways that I think would be available to nearly anyone who's interested in science policy and doesn't have a program on campus. So for instance, if you like, you can kind of keep track on what's going on in the state legislature. You can go and look to see what's going on in your district and see kind of what's on their town hall agenda or meetings. And if you see something that is maybe science related and you want to kind of engage with them, you know, there's a lot of times you can schedule an appointment and speak to a staffer or even your representative and really talk to them about, hey, you know, this is my expertise. I work in this area, and I really think, you know, when this issue comes up, I would suggest you vote in this way or that way, or these are the things that we have found in our field, and we should hope that you would consider them. Finding opportunities to write beyond your standard academic writing is great. I think I started with a blog. I just started blogging for my own good, and I would blog about science education policy. And I even said in my title, I'm using this as an experience for myself to start learning how to talk about scientific things to a non-scientific audience. This is an exercise for myself. And I got followers. That was exciting. And that kind of helped me land a position as an editor at the Journal of Science Policy as a graduate student, and I kind of was able to sort of snowball in a lot of ways. So the certificate isn't important, but I do believe it is important to start finding opportunities around yourself or creating opportunities where you can start having that demonstrated interest in science policy. And just really quickly, I saw that one of the participants was asking about the book that I was referring to earlier, and I have it actually right here, but of course it's mirror image. It's The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics, and the author is Roger Pilkey. So if you want to kind of just take a little bit of a nosedive into some of the background in science policy, I definitely recommend The Honest Broker.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question out of the Q&A queue. So Karen, you've worked for the government, in the private sector, and for nonprofits. What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of working for these different types of employers?
Sure, so that's a good question, actually. There's, I think, pros and cons to each different venue. So in the government, you know, I think just first, it's a very stable environment. It's a stable position. And, you know, I'm sure it can vary between offices or positions, but in my experience, I find my current position in some ways much more academic than my previous positions. I think it's probably, you know, it's at a science agency. The office I work in is somewhat small, so I found the dynamic in the office. This sort of reminds me more of like a lab feel than a, you know, a business office type environment. Because I'm in the government, I can no longer do advocacy, which I actually enjoyed. So I do miss that about my current position. So I guess that would be a con. But one thing that's nice is because, you know, because we're very focused on data analysis and sort of presenting the portfolio as it is, it's kind of more nuts and bolts and based on the facts, and sort of less on crafting arguments to be persuasive. And also, as you might imagine, as a con, probably it's, you know, it's more bureaucratic in some ways. And as a pro and a con, you know, just anytime you're part of the federal government, it's so huge, right? I mean, even though my office is small, you kind of can't help but feel you're a little bit a part of a giant machine. And there's a high degree of accountability, which is, you know, completely appropriate. In the private sector, you know, I think there's probably more opportunities for salary growth in the private sector. I know I enjoyed in my previous position with a firm really learning more of the business side and aspects to that, how there was a lot more emphasis on marketing and customer service and how to be sort of part of this, a service position. A con with that is, you know, it's, you know, at least slightly more focused on sort of bottom line, which is, again, you know, appropriate for that kind of position. But there's sort of always a pressure to come up with a new product of value for your clients. And I found in my experience it was slightly less scientific environment because you're dealing less with sort of the scientific issues and more with the politics or sort of culture of agencies and things like that. At a nonprofit, it was really great to be part of a culture that you really do feel like you're working for a common good. When I worked at FASIB, I definitely felt like I was serving a community and was helping be the voice of many scientists, which is a really rewarding feeling to have in a job. I think just a practical con is I think with that is often, I think in nonprofits, especially depending on your position, it can be hard to have as much salary growth. And depending on what the issue is, a lot of times because it's a more top level issue, and you can't really drill down on specific goals maybe that you would do for a very specific client. Sometimes it's hard to feel like you're having a true impact because you're focusing on these really big issues that you do see gradual change, and you are making a difference, but sometimes it takes a long time. So those are, I guess, some of the comparisons and contrasts of those.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Rob, you mentioned some of this during your portion of the webinar, but as a manager, you've hired people for science policy positions. What skills do you think are essential to securing a job in science policy?
So, yeah, I would reiterate a couple, I guess. I think, as we've I think all said, some demonstrated commitment, or that you've experienced it, that you've done some work, that you've had some exposure to the policy environment, and have an appreciation of what the good, the bad, and the ugly associated with that. And that's definitely something that we want to see. I want somebody with a good reputation and good judgment, and the ability to kind of show that they have good judgment. And I want the soft skills. I want to be able to identify and quantify that people have those kind of communication skills, the interpersonal skills to navigate issues, particularly when they can be, from time to time, they can be very controversial or very high profile. The ability to work well with others is absolutely something that I like to look for. Again, the ability to communicate in different forms and formats, and that's something that we very much want to see, the ability to put together a coherent and analytical statement about something that gets to the point, that is easily understood by a defined audience, whether that's somebody in Congress, or whether it's the public, or whether it's in our case, we're looking at, we communicate with a lot of different stakeholders at a scientific society. You're talking to policymakers, either in an agency or on the Hill. You're talking to the media. You're talking to the public. You're talking to university officials or researchers. And there's times where you need something that can hit all those audiences. There's times where you're trying to communicate with one of those specifically, and how you communicate with them. You need to recognize what they need to understand and how you can help them understand it. So that's really, I think, one of the things I really look for is strong written communication skills. I think flexibility is another one. Being nimble, being somebody who's inquisitive and open to learning new things, because that's a big part of what we're doing. As Karen just mentioned, sometimes the issues move slowly, but the factors that influence those issues can move very quickly. And so it may take years to get a piece of legislation passed, but the dialogue around it is usually moving on an ongoing basis. And you need to be cognizant of the issues that are sort of out and about and around it that will help shape it. So a desire to learn about things and continue to learn is very important. So I think those are some of the things.
Thank you. Let's go to a few questions that are in the queue. I think we'll do a few here that probably will be pretty short for our panelists to answer. We had two people inquire about, do you feel that a PhD is necessary to get a job in science policy, or is it possible with a master's or bachelor's degree only?
I can go first, I guess. At least in my experience, it kind of varies with the types of positions you're looking at, but there are definitely opportunities that I've seen for people with both a bachelor's or master's in a scientific area and not a PhD. At something like a government relations firm, I worked with a lot of people who had, maybe a bachelor's degree in a scientific area, but then had moved more into a political area, or and I know there's positions at NIH as well where if you have a master's of public health or other kinds of master's degrees, that there are opportunities. So I think a lot of times it's having a blend of experiences between the sciences and policy or political, and that can open up opportunities.
So I'm happy to add a little bit. For the fellowships, it is required to have a PhD, but that's not necessarily the case for all the jobs that are in science policy. But there are also a lot of positions that aren't related to the fellowship that you have to have a PhD, and you also have to have experience in the field. So I believe one of the people on the Q&A asked, what about people who've been scientists for a while and are thinking about going into the transition? There are program officer positions and program director positions at the different agencies where you don't necessarily had to have had any science policy experience, but you definitely need to have that PhD. And optimally, you'll have a record of research, meaning that you're very, very comfortable with the research environment and how it all works and how funding and grants and panels and reviews go. But if you think that you're earlier in the career and you want to try one of the fellowship opportunities to kind of get your foot in the door with science policy, the PhD is necessary.
Although I would say maybe not all the fellowships, because I think for the Merzion fellowship that I did, you could have a master's. You needed a graduate degree, but it could be a master's. So just look at the details. There's different options.
I also just weigh it as I myself have a master's degree, but not a PhD. There definitely are some fellowships that do restrict it to people who only have a PhD, but there are opportunities for people with a master's degree. I'm not aware of as many fellowship opportunities for people who just have a bachelor's degree. That's not to say that they're not out there, but I think as was just said, there are certainly job opportunities outside of fellowships. So another question that we've gotten from a few participants had to do with geographic opportunities. Do you see opportunities in science policy outside of the DC area?
So I can jump in, I guess, with that. There are, I think there are more probably in DC, just given the nature of, most of the federal agencies that are doing policy work are here. The nonprofits are largely headquartered here, things like that. Congress is obviously here. But that again is sort of defining the policy position as one that is an advocacy position or one that is focused on Congress or a direct interaction with an agency. And, there are a lot of opportunities for policy work to be done elsewhere, particularly if it's, it helps to be in DC because there's so many players in close proximity that you can easily interact with, you can meet and talk to and actually be in the same physical space with. That's helpful. But again, there's opportunities in various state legislatures or in state capitals. There's, depending upon what your issues are, if you're talking about the application of science to policy, for example, whether I would say public health or environmental policy are two cases that, there's a lot of opportunities in some states to work with state agencies or state legislatures on issues. So I think it to some degree it's up to you to identify where you want to be in the spectrum of careers, but a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit and you can be successful anywhere. So
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think it probably definitely is easier to maybe do the transition in DC, as a lot of the fellowships and opportunities are here and the people that you need to meet. But, I know a fair number of people who maybe started here and then, moved back to where they're from, and, got a policy job there. I know in particular California has a really good PhD fellowship, like a fellowship for PhDs to work with the state legislature there. And I also just wanted to emphasize that even though we've talked sort of a lot about fellowships and they're definitely the easiest way to go, I also know a lot of people in policy who have been much more creative than I was about navigating a transition from the bench to policy. So I think definitely keeping an open mind, meeting people, having informational interviews can lead to opportunities that, can take you to really amazing places. So, there's kind of not one formula for doing this, whether it's in DC or not.
If I could add one more just to build on that, I think a lot of us, our perspectives are obviously that of academia or government or societies, but there are also a lot of opportunities in universities or other institutions, so natural history museums, universities, industry, private industry has government relations practices. There are government relations firms, public affairs firms, things like that, out and about around the country that in different ways are doing science policy related things. So there are those opportunities also as a way to gain experience and get your foot in the door. And it's a matter of you're working on, in some cases, they may be very advocacy oriented positions, but you're representing the needs of your company, or you're interacting from your company with their lobbying firm or something like that. So yeah, keep an open mind and look for opportunities.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions about how do you actually find a job opening in science policy, through your network, through a listserv, or something else?
Well, one place you can start is usajobs.gov, and there all of the federal agencies list those job opportunities. So, National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health, NOAA, NIST, those are all places that advertise for positions where you can come in with a scientific background. That's one of the places where you can start.
I guess I would also suggest, there used to be a couple of great listservs, but those have kind of gone away. But I'll put in a plug too for scientific societies to get involved with them and become a member, because I know sometimes they are good about posting different kinds of jobs. And that's unfortunately kind of one of the challenges is in a lot of ways where meeting people and doing informational interviews comes into play, because I know, a lot of times people hear about jobs through networking more than sort of just like finding it online, although I've kind of done both. So it's possible to sort of just do it through the online website as well. But yeah, that's, I guess, part of keeping an open mind.
Thank you. One attendee asked, could panelists give some more concrete ideas about opportunities to demonstrate commitment to science policy? What is the type of opportunity right off the PhD bench, so to speak?
I know one thing I did early on when I was interested in science policy was I participated in a Society's Hill Day. And I even was able to apply for a travel award, and they paid for me to come to DC. It was, I think, second time I'd been to DC, since I was an adult, and I got to really participate in this Hill Day where I was grouped with other scientists, and we talked about the importance of funding to our research. So that's something, that definitely, join a scientific society, get involved. They're often, I'm sure AIBS, has Hill Days. And other ways to get involved in advocacy activities. I think you can also do things, I think the idea of starting a blog was a great idea. You can write articles or letters maybe for your local newspaper. See if you're part of an academic institution, if your department or program that you're in has some sort of newsletter or publication, you can write for that. So I think definitely just keeping up on the issues and looking for opportunities like that can be sort of a first step from the bench are a good way to get involved.
I'd add a couple more things. And Julie later, I think, we'll share a couple of opportunities Aibs has coming up to do hill visits and reverse visits and things. But I would also say, think about volunteering for a political campaign or something like that. Look for civic groups that might be doing things. There's a lot of citizen science type organizations popping up around the country, that are sort of focused on translating science for general audiences. Things like that can help develop your communication skills and show that you're actively trying to bridge. Also, that's a great way to start building your network and meeting people, and cultivating the network's critical. Policy very much moves off of information and sharing ideas with people and finding people that can help advance your issues because you have common ground with them, things like that. So I think those are definitely good ideas. Things that, again, a little bit of creativity goes a long way with all that. But I think those are a number of really good ones.
I have a quick concrete example really quickly. We started a very fledgling forum on our campus. I found a few other students who were also interested in science policy, and what we would do is we would host events on campus, and we found a way to get organized and actually recognized as a campus group. And we would have events where we would have community, you were invited to talk about GMOs. Community, you're invited to come and talk about stem cell research with this expert panel. And so that was an example of where we got creative, and I think it made a big difference.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more quick question. Do our panelists have any other advice that they would pass on to someone who's hoping to make the switch from research to science policy?
It's a good career if you like it, and if you once you get your feet wet, if it keeps if you find it fun and fulfilling, actively pursue it. It's a rewarding way to make a contribution to both science and to society. So good luck, and we hope to see you here soon.
And I would just add, especially if you're a trainee, definitely don't feel guilty about pursuing some of these outside activities to give yourself additional skills. I always viewed it as if you're a trainee, doing those things are part of your job. So I know it can be very easy to get involved in your research and feel like, I'm never going to graduate, or I'm never going to finish my postdoc, so I can't leave the bench. When you're a trainee, you're supposed to be sort of fostering a wide variety of skills to get your next position. So, definitely feel like pursuing those are part of what your goals should be. And I also would just say that, a lot of the skills that we've mentioned, while they are very important for science policy careers, most of them, I would argue, would probably make you a better scientist in any position you pursue. Whether you're a PI, being able to communicate, manage, get along with people, those are all things that I think would be useful in almost any career. So I encourage you to sort of strengthen as many of those skills as you can, sort of regardless of what direction you decide to go in.
All right, well, I'd like to again thank our panelists for participating today. I'm sorry that we didn't quite get to all of the questions that our attendees submitted. But I would encourage anyone, if we didn't get to your question, I've included my email address on this slide. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'll do my best to try to get an answer to you, either from myself or perhaps from one of our panelists. But we really do appreciate your participation in today's webinar. And I do want to give a special thanks to AIBS's individual and organizational members for their support. It's that support that makes the Leadership in Biology webinar series possible. And we would invite you to become a member of AIBS. And there's a link up on the screen now, so you can find out more information about how to do that. I'd also like to put a plug in for the AIBS Public Policy Report. That is a free biweekly publication that comes out. We cover what's happening here in DC and in the States in terms of science policy as it pertains to the biological sciences. And I would encourage you to get your free subscription to that. We also have some additional opportunities coming up this summer for those folks who are interested in getting more involved in the advocacy side of science policy. Our Congressional District Visits event is held in August and September. It does not involve any travel to DC. We've not quite opened registration for that event yet, but if you stay tuned on the AIBS website, we will be posting a link probably in about a month that will open registration for that free event. But there is information up at this point about past years of that event. So again, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. We will be posting a video recording of the event, and we'll be sending out a link for that shortly. Have a great day, everyone.